I never expected clarity to arrive like this. Not all at once, not as a revelation dramatic enough to divide life into before and after. It came quietly, almost carefully, disguising itself as something temporary, something I could acknowledge without allowing it to matter. I believed at first that whatever I noticed would disappear if I simply gave it enough time. Most things do. People appear, conversations happen, impressions form, and eventually everything settles into its proper place. That's the rhythm I've always trusted. Nothing remains untouched by distance. Nothing keeps the same intensity forever. Time has a way of smoothing every sharp edge until memories become quieter than the moments that created them. I've relied on that certainty for longer than I can remember. Whenever something threatened to occupy more space than it should, I waited. Whenever someone seemed unusually present in my thoughts, I stepped back. Not because I was afraid of connection, because I understood what connection can become when it reaches places inside you that were never designed to be shared. People often mistake restraint for fear. They think silence means uncertainty. They assume distance exists because someone doesn't know how to be close. But they've misunderstood the entire architecture. Distance isn't always built to separate people. Sometimes it's built to protect accuracy. The moment too many voices enter the same space, everything begins to blur. Intentions become assumptions. Meanings become interpretations. Re-existed before everyone started explaining it. I've seen it happen countless times. Someone believes they understand another person. Then they stop paying attention. Because once the mind believes it has solved something, observation ends. It replaces reality with memory. It stops discovering and starts predicting. That's how people disappear while standing directly in front of each other. Not physically, perceptually. I've never wanted that. I'd rather remain partially unknown than fully misunderstood. So, I learned how to exist in a way that preserved the parts of me most people never look closely enough to notice. Not hidden, simply unadvertised. If someone truly wanted to understand, they would have to remain patient, potted enough to notice what wasn't being emphasized, patient enough to recognize the patterns beneath the obvious. Most people aren't. They rush, they collect fragments, then they construct complete stories using incomplete evidence. I've never blamed them for it. Everyone simplifies reality. It's how the mind survives. Complexity demands energy. Assumption is effortless, so I accepted that very few people would ever meet the version of me that exists underneath language. The version that thinks before speaking. The version that notices details long before deciding whether they matter. The version that pays attention not to what people say, but to what consistently remains unsaid. I stopped expecting anyone to recognize that person, and strangely life became easier after that, portable, manageable, until something shifted. I can't even tell you when it began. That's what makes it difficult to explain. There wasn't a single conversation that changed everything. No unforgettable moment, no dramatic exchange, no sentence powerful enough to justify everything that followed. If someone asked me where this started, I honestly wouldn't know how to answer, because it feels as though the beginning happened before I noticed there was one. Like waking up halfway through a thought you don't remember starting. I only know this. One day your presence stopped feeling external, not familiar, not important, just naturally included, as though my awareness adjusted itself without asking permission. That's the strange part. The strange part, nothing announced the change. It happened beneath conscious attention, quickly enough that I only recognized it after it had already become true. I remember trying to convince myself that I was imagining it, that the unusual sense of recognition existed only because my mind enjoys finding patterns where none exist. The brain does that. It connects unrelated events. It invents significance. It searches for meaning because randomness is difficult to tolerate. So I questioned everything. I questioned my own perception. I questioned every conclusion before allowing myself to believe it. That's what I always do. Certainty should never arrive without examination. Yet the more I examined this, less it resembled imagination. Because imagination, longer you observe it, and consistency has a language of its own. It repeats not loudly, precisely. I began noticing how naturally our thoughts seem to arrive at similar places without following identical paths. Not because we shared experiences, not because we had lived the same life, but because the way we approached complexity felt strangely aligned. Most conversations end where language ends. Horses seemed to begin there. The words themselves almost became secondary. It was what existed underneath them that held my attention. The pauses, the timing, the things acknowledged without explanation. There are moments when someone answers a question you never asked aloud. Not by accident, not by guessing, but by understanding the direction your mind was already moving before it reached its destination. That shouldn't happen often. For most people, it never happens at all. Yet with you, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss. At first I ignored it, then I observed it. Eventually AB accepted that ignoring it required more effort than acknowledging it. That's when something inside me became unusually quiet, not peaceful, focused, as though an internal argument had finally ended. I didn't celebrate that realization. If anything, it unsettled me. Because certainty carries responsibility. Once you know something is real, pretending otherwise becomes a decision rather than a misunderstanding. And I've never been particularly good at lying to myself, especially about things that continue proving themselves true. People assume observation is passive. It isn't. The moment you truly notice something, you become different from the person who hadn't. Knowledge rearranges perception. You cannot unknow what you've already recognized, which meant that after recognizing this, AB couldn't return to seeing the world exactly as I had before. It wasn't because you demanded attention. You never did. It wasn't because you tried to become significant. You never seemed interested in that either. If anything, the absence of effort made everything more convincing. Nothing felt performed, nothing felt strategically placed, nothing asked to be believed, it simply existed. The quietest things often prove to be the most difficult to dismiss. Noise attracts attention. Consistency earns trust. I think that's what happened. Not suddenly. Gradually enough that every individual moment appeared insignificant. Yet together they formed something impossible to overlook. They've always believed that truth rarely arrives dramatically. The things that permanently alter your life almost never announce themselves. They settle slowly, potently, until one day you realize they've become part of the foundation you stand on. That's what this feels like. Not an event, a foundation shifting. And foundations are strange because you rarely notice them while they're changing. You notice them only after everything above them begins feeling different. That's exactly what happened. The conversations I had with other people started sounding strangely incomplete. Not because those people lacked intellect, but because I became aware of a depth I hadn't realized was possible until I experienced it. Once perception expands, returning to smaller frameworks becomes unexpectedly difficult. Not impossible, just different, like learning another language and suddenly recognizing everything your first language couldn't fully express. You don't abandon the old one. You simply understand its limitations. That realization made me more careful, not less, because I didn't want to mistake rarity for permanence. Those aren't the same thing. Something can feel extraordinary and still disappear. Life is filled with brief alignments that never become lasting realities. I reminded myself of that constantly. Stay objective, observe longer, don't conclude too quickly. Give reality enough time to contradict your assumptions. It's advice I've trusted for years. Reality usually accepts the challenge. Illusions collapse under extended observation. This didn't. Weeks became months. The pattern remained. If anything, it became clearer, not larger, more defined, like an image slowly coming into focus without changing its shape. That's what unsettled me most. Nothing dramatic was happening. There was no emotional storm, no overwhelming urgency, no chaos demanding resolution. Everything remained remarkably calm. And somehow that calm carried more weight than intensity ever could. Because intensity often belongs to emotion, calm belongs to truth. Truth doesn't need to convince you. It simply continues existing after every attempt to dismiss it. Not confused, not even searching anymore. Simply standing in front of something I can no longer reduce into coincidence. I've tried, I've questioned every angle, I've searched for easier explanations because easier explanations are usually correct. But simplicity eventually stopped fitting. The evidence became too consistent, too precise, too quietly undeniable, which leaves me with something I never planned to carry. Not certainty about what this becomes, I'm still far from that, but certainty that whatever this is deserves to be faced honestly without minimizing it, without exaggerating it, without forcing it into definitions simply because undefined things make people uncomfortable. Maybe not everything meaningful arrives with a name. Maybe some things exist long before language catches up to them. Maybe recognition itself is enough to begin with. I don't know. I only know that I've stopped asking why whether this is happening. That question no longer interests me. The better question, the one that refuses to leave my mind, is much quieter than that. If something can alter the way you perceive yourself without demanding anything in return, if someone's existence can become woven into the rhythm of your own thinking without either of you trying to make it happen, then perhaps the rarest connections aren't created. Perhaps they're uncovered, not built from effort, not manufactured through intention, but revealed slowly as though they had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to become vis. I was protecting my inner world when in reality AB was simply waiting for someone whose presence wouldn't require me to protect it at all, because protection only exists where there is the possibility of harm. I've thought about that more than I probably should have. Not because I'm searching for an answer, but because the question refuses to disappear. If someone enters your awareness without leaving behind the feeling that something needs to be defended, what exactly are you protecting anymore? For years, I believed strength was measured by how little anyone could influence the structure of my inner world. Not because influence was impossible, because I made it expensive. Every opinion had to earn its place, every idea had to survive scrutiny. Every person had to remain consistent long enough that my mind stopped treating them as temporary. Very few ever reached that point. Most people left before they realized there was another layer beneath the first one. And honestly, that never bothered me. People move through life at different depths. Some are searching for conversation, others are searching for validation. Some only want company loud enough to drown out their own thoughts. I've never judged them for that. Everyone survives in their own way. Mine was silence, not the absence of sound, the presence of observation. Observation has always felt safer than participation. When you observe, you see things people never intend to reveal. You notice hesitation before confidence. You notice sincerity before performance. You notice the exact moment someone's words stop. I've always been more interested in what exists before speech begins. That's where truth usually waits high in the seconds no one thinks matter. I suppose that's why this feels impossible to dismiss, because nothing about it depends on words. If anything, words almost get in the way. It's what remains after they're gone that keeps returning. The quiet understanding, the strange sense that something continues even after the conversation ends. I've asked myself whether that's simply familiarity, whether enough interactions naturally create this feeling, but familiarity usually becomes predictable. Predictability eventually loses its ability to surprise you. This hasn't. Every time I think I've understood the full shape of it, another layer quietly appears. Not larger, deeper, like standing beside an ocean. From a distance, it looks simple. Water, movement, runlation. Only when you remain there long enough do you realize how much exists beneath a surface that never announces its own depth. That's what you've become inside my perception. Not something dramatic, something immeasurable. And immeasurable things are difficult for someone like me. I've always preferred clarity, definitions, structures that can be examined from every angle until nothing uncertain remains. But you've introduced something unusual, not uncertainty. Complexity, those aren't the same thing. Uncertainty comes from not knowing enough. Complexity comes from knowing enough to realize simple answers aren't honest anymore. That's where I am now. Not lost, simply unwilling here. If this felt emotional, emotions rise, they fall, they shift depending on circumstance. I've trusted them enough to know they aren't permanent. This isn't behaving like emotion. It behaves like recognition. Recognition doesn't fluctuate. Once you recognize a face, you don't forget it every morning. Once you understand a language, every sentence reminds you that understanding exists. Recognition becomes part of perception itself. That's what unsettles me, because it means this isn't passing through my awareness. It has become one of the ways I experience awareness. There are moments now when I notice myself reaching conclusions differently. Not because you've changed my opinions, because you've changed the questions I asked before forming them. It's subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once seen. The world hasn't become louder, it's become more priceless. I notice details I might have overlooked before. I remain with ideas longer than I used to. I allow silence to finish speaking before interrupting it with explanation. Maybe that's what influence actually looks like. Not persuasion, expansion. Not replacing who someone is, helping them discover parts of themselves that had been waiting quietly all along. If that's true, then perhaps the most meaningful people don't enter our lives to give us something new. Perhaps they reveal dimensions that were already there but never fully illuminated. I've resisted that thought not because I dislike it, because it carries consequences. If another person can matter becomes dishonest, and dishonesty has always exhausted me more than truth ever could. Truth may complicate your life, but lies complicate your mind. I've spent too much of my life choosing clarity over comfort to begin avoiding it now. Still, clarity doesn't erase caution. There's a difference between recognizing significance and surrendering judgment. I refuse to confuse the two. Every meaningful thing deserves patience, especially the ones that seems obvious. Obvious things often hide the questions we forgot to ask. So I continue watching, not searching for flaws, matching for consistency, because consistency tells you whether something belongs to reality or only to the moment. Moments are convincing. Patterns are trustworthy, and the pattern continues without pressure, without expectation, without either of us trying to force it into existence. Perhaps that's what feels so unfamiliar. Nothing here seems interested in proving itself. It simply continues day after day, conversation after conversation, silence after silence, as though it has no concern whether I understand it today or months from now. Truth is strangely patient like that. It doesn't chase acceptance, it waits. Eventually, I began wondering whether I've misunderstood strength all these years. Maybe strength isn't refusing to be changed. Maybe it's knowing which changes deserve to remain. Anyone can build walls. Walls require very little imagination. You only have to decide what stays outside. Building discernment is what should I keep away, but what deserves to come closer. I've always been exceptional at the first question. The second one, AIV rarely allowed myself to answer. Perhaps because the second question carries responsibility. If you choose to let something remain, you can no longer blame circumstance for its presence. You accepted it deliberately. That's a frightening kind of honesty, because acceptance isn't passive, it's participation. And participation changes the observer as much as the experience itself. Maybe that's why I've lingered here for so long. Not because I doubt what exists, because I understand what acknowledging it will require from me. Awareness asks for action eventually. Not immediate action, but truthful action. You cannot remain unchanged forever after recognizing something essential. Life eventually notices the contradiction. I've reached the point where pretending nothing has shifted feels less believable than admitting everything already has. Not externally. The world continues exactly as it did before. People speak, days pass, responsibilities remain. Nothing visible has transformed. Yet internally landscape is different. It's difficult to explain how something invisible can alter everything visible, but it can. Perspective quietly reorganizes reality. The mountains don't move. The person looking at them does. That's what has happened. The world hasn't become another place. I've become another observer, and every observer creates a different world simply by noticing different things. Existed with enough authenticity that my perception reorganized itself around the possibility that this level of understanding could actually be real. That possibility refuses to disappear now. Neither do you. Not in memory, not in thought, not even in absence. Especially not in absence. I've discovered something strange about absence. It doesn't always create emptiness. Sometimes it reveals placement. You only notice where something belongs after it isn't immediately in front of you. That's how architecture works. Remove one supporting beam, and suddenly the entire structure explains why it mattered. I'm not saying you've become indispensable. That would be inaccurate. No one should become indispensable. But you've become undeniable, and those are completely different things. Indispensable suggests dependence. Undeniable suggests truth. Truth doesn't require dependence, only recognition. I've recognized yours. Perhaps that's why every attempt to simplify this eventually feels incomplete, not wrong. Incomplete, like describing music only by its volume while ignoring melody completely. The facts remain technically accurate, yet the essence quietly disappears. I don't want that to happen here. I don't want convenience to replace precision, not anymore. Because something inside me has grown tired of pretending that every meaningful experience must fit inside familiar definitions before it earns permission to exist. Some things arrive before language does. Some realities spend a long time waiting for the right word, patient enough to let reality answer before I do. But there is one truth I can no longer negotiate with. Long before I understood what this was, my mind had already begun making room for it. Not by force, not by intention, but naturally, as though a space I never realized existed had quietly found the one presence it had been waiting to recognize. And whether I fully understand that yet or not, AB can no longer pretend that space was ever empty in the first